On this edition of Independent Sources, are politicians courting ethnic communities only in a last-ditch effort to gain votes?
Conflict in Kashmir, a region historically torn between India and Pakistan, is once again victimized by violence.
And journalists under fire in China. Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Vianora Vinca.
And I'm Zyphus Lebrun, standing in while Gary's away. With only a few days to go before the midterm elections, political pugilism is in high gear. Candidates are stumping and taking shots at one another whenever they can, trying to convince the public they're more fit for the position than the other guy.
Some politicians have even taken to aggressively courting ethnic communities. Candidates like Comptroller John Liu have won on the strength of the ethnic vote, while Luis Sepulveda courted the Bronx's Bangladeshi community in an attempt to defeat incumbent Bronx Assemblyman Peter Rivera.
But how authentic are these forays into these communities? Gary sat down with Errol Louis of the Daily News and Daniel Bader of the Manhattan Times to get a sense of the extent of this effort to court the ethnic vote.
25 years ago in New York City, when you mentioned the term ethnic vote, politicians largely were referring to Jewish, Black, and Puerto Rican. Errol, how do we define the ethnic vote now?
Well, it's really just gotten broader. I mean, there was a time when politicians had to make, it was an obligatory stop at what they call the 3 I's. They had to go to Israel, they had to go to Ireland, they had to go to Italy to show the folks that they identified with their immigrant roots. Well, it's a lot broader now, and frankly, they'd have to go to the Dominican Republic and Haiti and Jamaica, and a lot of politicians do. So when you say ethnic now, it depends on who's talking, but generally, I think what it means is the large established immigrant groups as well as the newcomers. So that includes the Ukrainians now, that very much includes the Jamaicans, very much includes the Dominicans, increasingly the Chinese, and on the horizon, the Mexicans as well.
Then in Washington Heights, where your paper is based, what's your audience, and how do these politicians reach out to them?
We have, I tell people 75% of our readership and our population is majority Dominican American. There are Hondurans and Mexicans, and there's a mix and still a strong Puerto Rican base. But if you want to reach out to them, you have to reach, the Dominican votes, and that's who our elected officials are increasingly. And they have reached out in the mayoral elections last year. Mayor Bloomberg had an office there, and he made at least 2 or 3 visits to it, and showing that they mattered.
Okay. Errol, at which point do these groups get really involved in the voting process, in the political process? It's one thing having large numbers. It's another thing to actually be engaged, isn't it?
Well, yeah, that's true. And it's fascinating how people get to that point, get to the critical mass. In Brooklyn, it's been fascinating to watch. The Caribbean vote, this generic Caribbean vote, it includes people who, if you ask them individually, they won't say that they're Caribbean for the most part. They'll usually just say they're from Antigua, they're from Bahamas, they're from Jamaica or some other place. But in a very interesting process over the course of a generation, some people very specifically tried to create this Caribbean generic identity. And nowhere is it more visible than on Labor Day. Now, my family hails on my father's side from Trinidad and Tobago, where the carnival tradition starts. You see folks out there who come from islands which, if you know your history, have no carnival tradition whatsoever. And you got people out there dancing on the parkway, and they've made this big commercial market and very much a political market out of this generic identity. So there are lots of ways to get there. Another way, of course, is just sheer numbers. And that's what you see down in the Brighton Beach, Coney Island area, where what the political people call the Russians, although most of them are from Ukraine, have been growing by leaps and bounds. And eventually, they're at a point now where a number of political entrepreneurs have been pushing up against the system, running for office over and over again, and they've started to elect some of their own to local offices.
Then, can the Dominican vote in Washington Heights swing an election in the city?
I don't know if it can swing an election yet, but it's an important part of it. I think if the New York Times did a really interesting breakdown between the mayor and Democrat Bill Thompson last year, and he carried the Dominican vote as majority Democrats they followed the party line, and Billy Thompson really weighed on the Dominican elected officials up there to bring that vote to him. So it was really important to them. But I don't know if it sways it, but it's worth 25,000 votes.
Generally speaking, I've heard sometimes from academics saying whenever a candidate is reaching to the really deep ethnic vote, for instance, Bangladesh and sort of smaller groups, it means that they're desperate. They're looking for votes anywhere. Do you agree? Any of it?
Oh, no, I don't agree with that. I mean, look at the campaign of John Liu, who ran for controller. He's Taiwanese. He made an incredible number of ethnic alliances to the point where in the Irish Echo, they pronounced him the Irish candidate. He understood going after the ethnic vote, and he famously, I think it's going to go down in city lore, political lore, that on the night that he won the primary, against all odds, he specifically said, I wasn't endorsed by the Post or the Times or the News, and he wasn't. And then he rattled off about 13 different ethnic newspapers that had, in fact, endorsed him. So he did that as a very strategic calculation that he wasn't going to be acceptable in some corners of the mainstream press, nor with the vote. But he assembled piece by piece this very interesting coalition. And it really hadn't been done in such a citywide fashion since 1989, when David Dinkins unseated sitting mayor Ed Koch.
Well, in that scenario, what role did the ethnic media play in all of this?
Well, we wrote quite a bit about the small business survival bill that Robert Jackson was pushing during the mayor. He's a council member from District 7, which is the western half of our neighborhood of Washington Heights and Inwood. And he, John Liu was there. He was a supporter of the bill when he was a council member, and he was there, not for rallies for it, but he would come into the district often, and he has a real partnership with now council member Ydanis Rodriguez. They show up at each other's events. He comes to the neighborhood quite a bit. He was there just when he opened his district office. He made a special visit, and he was comptroller already. So they're lasting relationships too.
Well, we know that New York is a strong immigrant stronghold. Now, how does that translate with the number of American citizens and the number of registered voters? How engaged, essentially, are the ethnic or immigrant voters in this city?
Well, I think they matter, even if they're not registered. Because even if you're not registered, you've got family members who are. You've got neighbors who are. You've got coworkers who are. And out of concern for the cab drivers or the local merchants or the people in your neighborhood or the people in your family who maybe only got here relatively recently, people will be looking to pro-immigrant policies. They'll want to see a certain kind of friendliness and familiarity with immigrant communities. The politicians know this. They understand that they're not going to go to Chinatown and pick up every last vote that's in Chinatown, but that it's important that they be seen as friendly in Chinatown and Manhattan in order to pick up votes in Chinatown, in Sunset Park, or out in Queens.
Well, speaking of that, last year during the mayoral campaign, you had a cavalcade up through Washington Heights for politicians looking for votes. Is this the same thing happening this season?
No, not at all, actually. Even Eric Schneiderman hasn't been in the district very much. I think he knows that he's locked his own district down and he doesn't have to be there. But when Carl Palladino made his swing through, he didn't come to Washington Heights, as far as I know. And same thing with Dan Donovan. We haven't seen him either.
Why do you think that's the case?
Well, there's been some public grumbling by Black and Latino leadership that they've been taken for granted, very much as Dan says, that the Democrats have tried to do what they very often will do, which is try to look for votes in the suburbs and in upstate. Traditionally in a statewide race, there are about the same number of registered voters upstate as in New York City, about 4.5 million each. And then the balance, about 2.5 million, are in the suburbs. And Republicans do better upstate, Democrats do better in the city. Everybody fights over the suburbs. So they're trying to run around and pick up as much as they can. And to that extent, they're counting on their home base to turn out for them. It's a somewhat risky strategy if people start to feel alienated, and there's some signs that there's some of that going on in the Democratic side right now. On the other hand, the Republican candidate, Carl Palladino, he did well in Niagara County, he did well in Buffalo. If you look at the numbers, he didn't do very well in the suburbs. He didn't do very well in the North Country. So they've both got their work cut out for them.
You know, one last question. When we talk about the base is upset with the Democrat, I mean, then what can, let's say, Schneiderman do for Washington Heights as Attorney General?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that the immigrant Dominicans, maybe not the second generation Dominicans, but they're still afraid of the government. So having an attorney general's office or trying outreach that way is not going to work. I know that Manhattan DA is considering the same thing. That might work if they're being taken advantage of, but except for the recent Vantage settlement of the property owner who's taking advantage of low-income tenants, they don't see that level of government as being helpful.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it at that. Errol Louis, Dan Bader, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thanks
you
for having us.
Still to come on Independent Sources, the conflict in Kashmir.
But before that, Marlene Peralta with some other news.
Thanks, Zyphus. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic media. Officials at the Xuan Wen Academy in Lower Manhattan have officially demanded an apology from a New York One reporter, the World News reports. The Chinese publication says the school's principal issued a letter saying that the reporter, Lindsay Chris, used false and distorted facts in a recent story. Chris reported that the celebrated bilingual school for low-income students was currently under investigation for several charges. The charges include allegedly asking parents to pay $1,000 to continue Mandarin classes. From the Irish Echo, the president of the Irish Nurses and Midwives Organization has called the migration of new nurses to other countries a national scandal. Sheila Dickinson said that as of the year 2008, almost 2,000 nurses have moved to the United Kingdom and the U.S. in order to get full-time jobs. Dickinson says this trend is forcing Ireland to hire nurses from other countries. Filipino veterans have filed a lawsuit against the federal government. According to the Filipino Reporter, the suit claims the benefits they receive are far lower than what U.S. veterans get. The suit also wants widows of Filipino soldiers whose benefits were approved after they died to receive their husband's share. A similar lawsuit was filed earlier this year, making the same demands. The Forward reports that the proposed amendment to change Israel's citizenship law has sparked a controversy, although it is very likely to get approved. Some experts attribute this uproar to the fact that the amendment will force non-Jews to pledge in favor of a Jewish state. The current oath reads, quote, "I will be a loyal national of the state of Israel," end quote. The new version will read, quote, "Israel as a Jewish and democratic state," end quote. And finally, El Diario La Prensa has recognized the work of many men who represent diverse professional areas with an L award. Some of the winners include New York One journalist Juan Manuel Benitez, host of the Spanish-language political show Pura Política, and actor Luis Salgado from the popular Broadway show In the Heights. El Diario's publisher, Rosana Rosado, said the L Awards hope to highlight the important stories of those men who can be examples to the youth. Those are just a few headlines from the ethnic media. Now back to Vianora and Zyphus in the studio.
Thanks, Marlene. Kashmir is at a crossroads of conflict between India and Pakistan. Both countries have claimed ownership of the region since English colonial rule ended in 1947. They've been to war twice over the issue, and the internal conflict continues today.
India wants Kashmir to remain a part of the Indian nation and wants Pakistan to end support to militants who want to unite Kashmir and Pakistan. Pakistan wants a plebiscite where Kashmiris will vote for which country they want to join. And here's the rub. Kashmiris want independence that neither of these countries is willing to give.
This has most recently led to another round of violence, with some reports claiming that Indian forces fired on peaceful assemblies. I spoke with human rights activist Angana Chatterji and Tariq Mohiuddin, who is from Kashmir, about the conflict and the current state of affairs in the region. So we're talking about the part of Kashmir that is administered by India. There is a part of Kashmir that's ruled by Pakistan and one that's controlled by China. But it's in the Kashmir that's controlled by India where the protests have flared up in the last few months. Angana, what has precipitated these protests at this point in time?
I'll start with this year. On April 30th of this year, the Indian forces executed 3 Kashmiri youth in a fake encounter execution in Kupwara district, and they claimed them to be militants from Pakistan. And that led to a series of protests, and every protest started out peacefully. They were brutalized by Indian forces. They would fire into the protests. The protests would escalate. Then someone would die, and there would be another protest as an act of mourning, taking people to their last rites and to their burial. The police would again fire into protests. The protests would escalate. Youth would throw stones. Police would and paramilitary would further brutalize. This incredible viciousness with which civil disobedience was targeted in Kashmir led to thousands, hundreds of thousands coming out onto the streets. And there's a larger context for this. The youth, who we largely disproportionately saw on the streets this summer, they are tired, they are fed up. Every democratic means of civil disobedience, of registering their grievances against India's authoritarian government of Kashmir, is denied them systematically. These are people who for the last 20 years have only known India's authoritarian government of Kashmir. And their demands this summer, as in the summer of 2008 and 2009, were quite clear. They asked for azadi, for freedom. Freedom means many things across Kashmir, and it is quite contested in rural and urban spaces. But freedom, the idea of freedom, is steadfastly united in one thing, that for Kashmiris in India-ruled Kashmir, freedom always signifies an end to India's authoritarian government.
Tariq, you are very young. You only came to the United States a few years ago. What are your memories of growing up and living in Kashmir?
Yeah, I really agree with Angana. She describes the pain of Kashmiri people. But the problem, every time people come on streets, there's a flare-up in protests. People say something is going on in Kashmir. But this problem has been there for 63 years. People came out before on streets. Maybe at that time there was no good media coverage. At that time people didn't know about this problem. But now, because of the other associated things which are very close to Kashmir, about Pakistan issue or other issues, that this is also coming in media. But we are languishing for 63 years for people to know that Kashmiri people are in pain, and they are under oppression from Indian state. But every time people try to find out a mean to fight out their oppression, their subjugation by Indian authority. They come 20 years ago in 1989, people thought that they will take arms and they will fight with India, which was not a good idea, and then failed. And now people know that they don't have any other way of fighting with this mighty country, is to do to not just a civil disobedience, coming on streets and protesting.
Angana, talking about the mighty country of India, you are not a Kashmiri. I just want to specify that you were born in Calcutta, and your long-standing work as a human rights activist for the Kashmiris have put you at odds with the Indian government, and you were actually legally charged by the Kashmir police for inciting and acting against the Indian state. Tell us more about that.
My father, was actually a freedom fighter against British colonial rule in India. And I learned growing up from him that the Indian state's occupation of Kashmir is morally something that Indian citizens need to defy, to dissent. And as a scholar, that's what I understand my work to be. I think they charged me with inciting actions against the state. And a colleague of mine, I wrote an article on mass graves. This was in 2008. And they took actions against the editor, who was subsequently had to leave his job in Kashmir for this daily called Etalat. And the editor was Zahiruddin at that time. And then we brought out our report, Buried Evidence, documenting the existence of 2,700 mass graves. And I think the Indian state, their responses has been to target those who speak up and seek to internationalize the issue. The idea of the Indian state that this is an issue between India and Kashmiris, and that Kashmiris are wayward in not accepting that Kashmir is an integral part of India. And this is an official narrative. This is official history. This is revisionist history. Kashmir's accession to India was temporary. And as Tariq said about the dissension on the streets and the grievances of the Kashmiri people, I would even go further back and say this started in 1931 when Kashmiris actually formally organized to dissent India's encroachment of Kashmir. This summer, since June 11th, about 111 Kashmiri, largely Kashmiri youth, women and men have died, and again, largely men. Children have been tortured. Elders have been detained without explanation. There have been over 75 days of curfew and 75 days of agitation and strikes. And I think the condition that we are seeing in this, India is attempting to broker a violent peace. And as it argues for a seat on the United Nations Security Council, and the United States and the international community has largely remained silent.
Tariq, President Obama is expected to go to India soon. What are Kashmir's expectations, if any, of his visit? He's reportedly expected to address the Kashmiri issue.
Yeah, we're expecting a lot from Mr. Obama because of being head of a powerful state, and the United States of America, which is one of the big countries who can make a difference for common Kashmiri, and who can strongly address this problem for common Kashmiris, not for other reasons, because it is the common Kashmiri who is suffering because of the subjugation and continuous pain of subjugation. So we are expecting him to press on to India to solve this problem by adequate means, by addressing the real problem, which is Kashmiris who are suffering and who are asking for a legitimate solution to the problem, and which is not less than the self-determination and an opportunity to come out and give an opportunity for people to determine what they want and what they want to do for their future.
Angana, we only have a minute left. Should a plebiscite be held now, what the results would be, you think?
I think that before a plebiscite can be held, there needs to be a moratorium on violence. The Indian military needs to withdraw. There needs to be certain preconditions before people can exercise their rights. And I believe if you actually put this to a vote, the people of Kashmir, as I understand today, will argue extremely determinedly for self-determination. And I think that human rights violations in Kashmir will not stop without removing the military, and the military cannot be removed without rupturing India's will to power over Kashmir. And there needs to be certain preconditions for whether a plebiscite is going to be held, for that to go forward, for reparation, for prosecutions, and for demanding accountability from India for its immoral rule over Kashmir for the last 63 years and certainly the last 20. Legal impunity in Kashmir is the cover for moral impunity of Indian rule.
Tariq Mohiuddin and Angana Chatterji, thank you very much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
When we come back, China breaks its promise to foster a free press. And finally tonight, a new series from us at Independent Sources. We're calling Journalists Under Fire. At least once a month, we'll bring you stories from around the world about reporters who have been imprisoned, exiled, or faced some other cruel fate for doing their jobs.
This week, we focus on China and the scores of Chinese journalists, bloggers, and human rights activists who were imprisoned, put under house arrest, or expelled from Beijing for speaking out against the government and the 2008 Olympic Games.
In 2001, Chinese leaders promised the International Olympic Committee that its human rights record would improve should China win the right to hold the Olympics.
The Games are long gone, and the country is no closer to having a free press. Reporters Without Borders is calling for the journalists' release.
Everyone in China that is a member of the government wanted everyone to see the happy picture they painted, and they did. The Chinese government painted a beautiful picture of the Olympics. People who watched the Olympics saw a very clean, pristine, well-structured, well-managed game. But behind the scenes, scores and scores of people were being beaten, sentenced to long jail sentences, kicked out of the country, equipment confiscated, their wives and children put under house arrest. So it was a different picture for Chinese civil society behind the scenes. The current regime, the communist regime in China, has 9 but just released 1 Olympic prisoner. These are the activists that started the "We Want Human Rights, Not the Olympics" campaigns. Many of the people who have been detained for a long time are either sentenced to re-education in work camps, hefty prison sentences, and in many cases they're abused in these prisons. The release of Chen Guangcheng, the blind activist and human rights lawyer, is a big case of Reporters Without Borders and trying to really lobby with governments that work with China, the French government, the United Kingdom, and the US, to put pressure on the Chinese to say, look, under your constitution, the Chinese Constitution, Amendment 35, you indicate that free information and free expression are part of your constitution and a right of every citizen. So you're violating your laws. And if you want to continue engaging in big business deals in the United States and big business deals in other countries in Europe, then you're going to have to really live up to releasing these prisoners. So Reporters Without Borders, among a number of other human rights groups that we work with and partner with inside China, is really putting pressure on the Chinese government to get these prisoners released. But at the end of the day, they're always going to be on a Chinese blacklist of the government, meaning they're not going to be able to take up their jobs as journalists and reporters and activists anymore, because they're going to be part of the propaganda department's list of people who don't follow the Chinese line and incite violence and try to go outside or are subversive against the Chinese communist line.
That's our show. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again next week.
Till then, be independent-minded.